Abigail, a patient who hadn't uttered a sound in months, suddenly broke her silence. Her voice came out deep and rough, like gravel grinding underfoot. Not her own, but something older, something borrowed from the shadows. She locked eyes with Nurse Sarah and rasped, "Tick-tock, your time's running out." The words sank into the room, cold and unyielding. Minutes later, the phone in the nurse's station shrilled. Sarah picked it up, and her brother's voice cracked through sobs. Their mother had just collapsed, dead from a sudden heart attack. The precision of Abigail's words clawed at Sarah's nerves, leaving her skin prickling with dread. It didn't stop there. In the days that followed, Abigail, once a hollow figure in her hospital bed, turned her strange gaze on others. Her eyes, dim and lifeless before, now shimmered with an eerie spark as she delivered her cryptic warnings. To Nurse Rachel, she whispered, "The tiny heartbeat will fade too soon," her lips twitching into a faint, unsettling smirk. Rachel shook it off, chalking it up to a sick woman's delusions, but a week later, her sister's tearful call confirmed the worst: a miscarriage. Whispers spread through the hospital, nervous glances darting toward room 17, where Abigail lay. Her predictions, sharp and haunting, stirred questions no one wanted to voice. What force spoke through her? Was she peering beyond the veil, or had her fractured mind somehow snagged the threads of destiny? Nights at the hospital grew heavier after that. The usual quiet turned thick, almost alive. Sarah stood by the break room window, staring at the parking lot's faint glow under flickering streetlights. Her hands clutched a cold coffee mug, her thoughts trapped in that first moment Abigail spoke. The old woman had lifted her head from the pillow, gray hair spilling like a shroud, her face, once blank, suddenly sharp with intent. That voice, jagged as rusted metal, had pinned Sarah in place. "Tick-tock, your time's running out," she'd said, and her cloudy eyes flared briefly, like a glimpse of something far off and wrong. The memory wouldn't let go. The phone call still rang in Sarah's skull. Her brother's broken words painted the scene, their mother crumpling in the kitchen, hands pressed to her chest. A heart attack, the doctor said, swift, merciless. Sarah had stormed back to Abigail's room after, heart pounding, but found her staring at the ceiling, still as stone. The woman they'd all dismissed as a shell knew things she shouldn't know. 3 nights later, Abigail struck again. Rachel was at her bedside, adjusting the monitors, lulled by the patient's usual silence. Then Abigail's head jerked toward her, quick and unnatural. "The tiny heartbeat will fade too soon," she hissed, her voice slicing the air. Rachel's forced smile trembled, fear coiling tight in her gut. "What do you mean?" she asked, but Abigail turned away, her breathing slow and even, as if nothing had happened. Rachel fled the room, cold sweat soaking through her scrubs. She told herself it was nothing, a fluke. But when her sister lost the baby, Rachel's world tilted. She hid in the staff bathroom, sobbing until her chest ached, the question burning, how did Abigail know? The hospital buzzed with unease. Orderlies and nurses dodged room 17, muttering excuses to stay away. Even Dr. Carter, who sneered at anything unproven, faltered. He ordered tests, scans, brainwaves, blood work, but the results were maddeningly normal. "She's just an old woman with dementia," he insisted, though his tone betrayed him. He couldn't explain her knowledge, and neither could anyone else. The staff traded theories in hushed tones, intuition, coincidence, something darker. No one slept easy. One midnight, an orderly named Jake slipped into Abigail's room. He didn't buy the ghost stories. Everything had an answer, he'd always said. Flashlight in hand, he sat by her bed, watching her chest rise and fall. Her eyes were shut, her face slack. He smirked, ready to call it nonsense, when her voice rasped out, low and steady. "Red water will take your friend." Jake's breath caught, the beam shaking in his grip. He tried to speak, but his tongue stuck. Abigail went quiet, leaving the dark to press in around him. The next day, he laughed it off to Sarah and Rachel, voice tight. "Red water? Maybe she meant soda," he quipped, but his eyes stayed hard. 2 days later, his oldest friend drowned in a river, the water stained red with clay. Jake heard the news, went pale, and walked out mid-shift. He didn't come back. Sarah bought a notebook after that. She scribbled down every word Abigail spoke, hunting for a thread, a clue. The others called it an obsession, but she couldn't let it go. One afternoon, Abigail met her gaze and murmured, "A shadow follows you." Ice slid down Sarah's spine, but she kept coming back, asking questions that got half answers or none at all. Abigail's mutterings, "The clock will stop, the birds will fly north," seemed random, yet they came true. The nurse's station clock died the next day, and the crows that haunted the roof vanished by morning. Rachel chose avoidance. Her grip on reason had slipped, and Abigail's voice was a blade she couldn't face. But one night, alone on duty, she heard her name drift from room 17. Her stomach knotted, but her legs moved anyway, dragging her to the doorway. Abigail sat upright, a rare sight, her eyes glinting in the gloom. "The light will fail, and you'll stay," she said. Rachel bolted, shaking. The next morning, the hospital's power cut out for hours, and Rachel stayed on, roped into covering a sick colleague's shift. The building felt warped, like reality was fraying at the edges. Nurses swapped stories in the halls. Abigail was a witch, a prophet, something not human. Dr. Carter, against his better judgment, cracked open books on the unexplained. Sarah's notebook thickened with scribbled prophecies, each one a splinter in her mind. She didn't know what it meant, but she felt it. Abigail was a door to something vast, maybe the machinery of fate itself. The air grew heavier with each passing shift. A janitor swore he saw Abigail's shadow stretch too long across the wall, though her body hadn't moved. A nurse claimed the room's temperature dropped when Abigail spoke, her breath fogging in the dim light. Sarah kept writing, her pen scratching late into the night. One entry read, "The mirror breaks at dawn." The next morning, a glass pane in the lounge shattered without cause, scattering shards across the floor. Rachel broke after that. She cornered Sarah in the break room, voice low and ragged. "She's not right. She's not normal. We need to transfer her, get her out." Sarah shook her head, clutching her notebook. "We can't. She's trying to tell us something." Rachel stared, then walked away, her hands trembling. Dr. Carter called a meeting, his skepticism worn thin. "We've got no evidence," he said, "but I can't deny what's happening." He suggested observation, more tests, but no one wanted to volunteer. The staff dwindled, some quit, others took leave. Room 17 became a black hole, pulling everyone toward it yet repelling them all the same. Sarah stayed. She sat by Abigail's bed one stormy night, the rain hammering the windows. The old woman stirred, her voice a whisper against the thunder. "The end comes in threes." Sarah wrote it down, her hand steady despite the fear. 3 days later, a fire alarm tripped, a pipe burst, and a patient coded, all within an hour. The staff called it chaos. Sarah called it proof. The hospital was a shell now, its corridors too quiet, its lights too dim. Abigail's presence lingered like a stain, her words a riddle no one could solve. Sarah filled her notebook's last page and started another, chasing the truth. Rachel transferred out, unable to bear the weight. Dr. Carter kept his books, searching for answers in the dark. Abigail watched it all, silent again, her eyes glinting with secrets she wouldn't share. Nurses and patients kept catching glimpses of a figure who looked exactly like Nurse Clara, appearing in places she couldn't have reached. This strange double mirrored her every detail, her short auburn hair, her crisp uniform, even the way she tilted her head while flipping through charts or offered a quiet smile. But whenever someone got close, the figure dissolved into thin air, leaving nothing but a chill in its wake. Even Clara herself crossed paths with this phantom twin, and that encounter turned the staff's curiosity into a gnawing unease. The sightings went on, unexplained, forcing everyone to grapple with the same question. Was this a glitch in their tired minds, or was something spectral stalking the hospital's halls? The first sighting came late one Tuesday night. A patient in room 8 buzzed for help, swearing he'd seen Clara slip into his room, adjust his IV, and leave without a word. When Nurse Hannah checked the log, Clara had been on the opposite wing, tending to a crash cart emergency. The patient insisted, his voice shaky, "It was her. I know her face." Hannah brushed it off as delirium. People saw things in the dim light of a hospital night. But then it happened again. 2 days later, an orderly spotted Clara standing by the supply closet, scribbling on a clipboard. He called out, and she turned, only to vanish as he stepped closer, the clipboard clattering to the floor. Clara, meanwhile, was in the break room, sipping tea, oblivious. The whispers started small, a ripple among the staff. Patients traded stories of the other Clara, adjusting pillows or lingering at the foot of their beds. Nurses saw her shadow flicker past doorways, her familiar silhouette moving too fast to catch. At first, they laughed it off. Long shifts bred hallucinations, they said. But the sightings piled up, too consistent to ignore. Hannah caught a glimpse one evening, rounding a corner to see Clara standing by the nurse's station, her back turned. "Hey, didn't you just clock out?" Hannah called. The figure didn't respond, just faded into the wall as Hannah blinked, her stomach twisting. Clara had left an hour earlier. Clara herself didn't believe it until she saw it too. It was a quiet Sunday shift, the kind where the halls hummed with the soft beep of machines. She'd stepped into the bathroom to wash her hands, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. As she glanced up, her reflection wasn't alone. In the mirror behind her stood herself. Same auburn hair pulled into a tight bun, same blue scrubs, same faint freckles dusting her cheeks. The double smiled, a slow, knowing curve of the lips, while Clara's own face froze in terror. She spun around, heart slamming against her ribs, but the room was empty. The sink kept dripping, the only sound breaking the silence. When she stumbled out, pale and trembling, the others knew something had shifted. This wasn't just gossip anymore. The hospital felt different after that. Shadows seemed sharper, the air heavier. Nurses avoided walking alone, their footsteps echoing too loud in the sterile corridors. Patients asked about the second nurse, some with fear, others with a strange awe. Clara tried to keep her head down, focusing on her rounds, but she felt eyes on her. Real or not, she couldn't tell. One night, she caught Hannah staring, her friend's gaze lingering too long. "What?" Clara snapped, sharper than she meant. Hannah hesitated, then muttered, "Just making sure it's you." The words stung, but Clara couldn't blame her. Doubt had seeped into them all. Dr. Ellis, the floor's supervisor, called it exhaustion. "You're all overworked," he said, arms crossed in the staff room. "The mind plays tricks when you're running on fumes." He ordered extra breaks, but it didn't stop. An orderly swore he saw Clara in 2 places at once, checking a chart in room 12 while laughing with a patient in room 15. A janitor found a tray of instruments laid out in the OR, arranged just as Clara always did, though she hadn't been near it all day. The double wasn't just appearing, it was acting, mimicking her routines with an eerie precision that defied logic. Clara started keeping a log, scribbling notes in a battered journal. Tuesday, 11:47 p.m. Patient in room 8 saw me. I was in the East Wing. Friday, 2:13 a.m. Orderly found clipboard by closet. I was asleep at home. She didn't know why she wrote it, only that it anchored her, kept her from unraveling. The sightings grew bolder. One nurse, Mark, watched the double glide down the hall, her shoes silent on the tile. He followed, pulse racing, until she turned a corner and was gone, leaving a faint scent of antiseptic in the air. Clara's scent, he realized later, though she'd been off shift for hours. The breaking point came during a storm. Rain lashed the windows, thunder rumbling through the walls. Clara was in the medroom, counting pills, when the lights flickered. She looked up, and there it was, her double, standing by the door, staring. Its eyes were hers, hazel and bright, but hollow, like a mask with nothing behind it. Clara dropped the bottle, pills scattering across the floor. "Who are you?" she whispered, voice cracking. The double tilted its head, mirroring her, then stepped forward. Clara backed into the counter, her breath shallow, but before it reached her, the lights surged back on, and it was gone. She sank to the floor, trembling, the sound of rain drowning out her gasps. Word spread fast. Mark found her there, helped her up, but his hands shook too. "We need to do something," he said, voice low. "This isn't normal." Hannah agreed, her usual calm fraying. They cornered Dr. Ellis the next day, demanding answers. He rubbed his temples, gray hair catching the light. "I've checked her file, her vitals. Clara's fine. There's no medical basis for this." He paused, then added, "But I've seen it too." The room went quiet. He'd glimpsed the double in his office, flipping through a chart, vanishing when he blinked. "I don't know what it is," he admitted, "but it's tied to her." The staff split after that. Some clung to science, stress, fatigue, a shared delusion. Others whispered about ghosts, a spirit wearing Clara's face. Clara herself felt like a stranger in her own skin. She'd catch her reflection and flinch, half expecting it to move on its own. Patients stopped trusting her, their eyes darting as she approached. One old man grabbed her wrist, his grip frail but desperate. "Which one are you?" he rasped. She pulled away, unable to answer. The double grew restless. It appeared in the cafeteria, pouring coffee Clara never drank. It lingered by the ER doors, watching ambulances roll in. Once, it stood over a sleeping patient, adjusting his blanket, only to vanish when a nurse screamed. Clara's journal filled with frantic entries. Monday, 3 a.m., seen in room 22. I was in the lounge. Wednesday noon, cafeteria sighting. I was on break 2 floors up. She showed it to Hannah, who read in silence, her face paling. "This isn't you," Hannah said finally. "It's something else." The hospital turned into a maze of fear. Lights buzzed too loud, shadows stretched too far. Mark swore he heard the double hum, a tune Clara sometimes sang, though no one else did. Dr. Ellis dug through old records, hunting for a clue. Maybe a death, a tragedy tied to the building. He found nothing, but the unease clung to him, etching lines deeper into his face. Clara stopped sleeping, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands unsteady. She'd walk the halls, waiting for it, daring it to show itself. One night, she got her wish. The ward was still, the storm long past. Clara sat in the nurse's station, alone, her journal open. A shadow moved in the corner of her eye. She turned, and there it was, her double standing by the window, staring out at the dark. Its posture was hers, its silence deafening. Clara stood, legs shaking. "What do you want?" she demanded. The double turned, its smile slow and wrong, then faded into the glass. A crack split the window pane, sharp and sudden, though nothing had touched it. The next day, Clara requested a transfer. Dr. Ellis approved it, his voice tired. "Maybe distance will help," he said, but his eyes doubted it. Hannah hugged her goodbye, tears brimming. Mark just nodded, too rattled to speak. Clara left her journal behind, its pages a map of something she couldn't name. The sightings stopped after she left, but the hospital never recovered. Nurses watched their reflections too closely, flinched at every creak. Patients asked about the other nurse, long after Clara was gone. Dr. Ellis kept the journal, locked in his desk, its words a quiet haunt. The double was silent, but its echo lingered, a question mark carved into the walls. One night at 3 o'clock in the morning, the hospital's stillness shattered. John, a patient who'd been silent and still for weeks, erupted into wild, uncontrollable laughter. The sound sliced through the empty halls like a scream, sharp and unhinged. Nurse Emily, startled from her paperwork, bolted to his room, her heart pounding louder with every step. She found him sitting straight up in bed, his eyes wide and glowing, locked on an empty corner. When she asked what was wrong, his head turned slowly, a twisted grin on his face, and he whispered in a voice trembling with eerie joy, "He's standing right behind you." Emily whipped around, her breath snagging in her throat, but there was nothing, just cold tiles and shadows. John's laughter softened into a smirk, his gaze still pinned to that spot, as if something invisible lingered just out of reach. After that night, he went quiet again, but his eyes never left that corner, watching, waiting. The hospital had always been a predictable place. Quiet nights, the hum of machines, the soft shuffle of feet. But after John's outburst, everything felt heavier, like the building itself was holding a secret. Emily couldn't forget that laugh. It echoed in her head, too big for the small, dim room. She'd been a night shift nurse for years, used to all kinds of patients. But John was different. He'd arrived weeks ago, mute and withdrawn, his file only mentioning severe trauma with no details. Until that night, he'd been a ghost, barely looking at her. His room sat at the hall's end, isolated from the livelier wards. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, their glow fading into the shadows. That night, when Emily rushed in, John's laughter stopped abruptly, leaving only her footsteps ringing out. He sat stiffly, his thin hands clutching the bedsheet, his usually blank face alive with a strange fire. His dark, unblinking eyes stared into the corner where the walls met in a shadowy fold. "What's so funny, John?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay calm despite the chill crawling up her arms. He didn't reply at first, just kept staring past her. Then he turned, his grin stretching unnaturally wide. "He's standing right behind you," he said, his voice a mix of dread and excitement. Emily's pulse spiked. She glanced back, half expecting a figure in the dark, but the corner was empty. When she faced John again, his grin was gone, and he was staring at the spot once more, silent, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, Emily told Dr. Adler, the ward's psychiatrist, about it. He listened, his brow creased, tapping his pen. "Hallucinations, most likely," he said briskly. "Trauma does that. We'll adjust his meds." Emily wasn't so sure. John's focus was too steady, too specific, not the frantic glances of someone lost in delusions. He watched that one corner, night after night, like he was expecting something to step out of it. Others noticed too. Mark, another nurse, cornered her in the break room, his usual grin missing. "You seen him today? Still staring. Doesn't even blink." Emily nodded, stirring her coffee absently. "It's like he's looking at someone," she said quietly. Mark shivered. "Yeah, freaky as hell. Think he's really seeing something?" She didn't know how to answer. Days went by, and John stayed silent, but his stare didn't waver. He'd sit for hours, lips twitching, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes grimacing, like he was talking to someone only he could see. Emily started lingering by his door on rounds, peering through the window. He'd tilt his head now and then, as if listening, or tap his fingers on the bed frame in a steady rhythm. It felt deliberate, like a secret code. One sleepless night after her shift, Emily dug through the hospital's archives, hunting for anything about room 12. The place was old, its wings patched together over years, and staff whispered about haunted rooms, stories she'd always brushed off. But now, with John's laughter haunting her, she needed something concrete. She found nothing, no deaths, no strange reports, just old logs of patients coming and going. Still, the unease wouldn't let go. John's strangeness started creeping into her too. She'd catch herself looking over her shoulder on rounds, feeling eyes where there were none. Once, adjusting an IV, she felt a cold breath on her neck. She spun around, nothing. She forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. Mark got jumpy too. One night he grabbed her arm in the hall, his face pale. "I heard something," he whispered. "In his room. A voice." Emily frowned. He doesn't talk, Mark." "Not him," he said, shaking his head. "It came from the corner, low, like muttering." Her gut twisted. "What did it say?" she asked, dreading the answer. Mark swallowed hard. "Couldn't tell, but it wasn't him, Em." He walked off, leaving her alone in the quiet. Dr. Adler upped John's meds, but it didn't help. If anything, his focus sharpened. He started humming, a low, grating sound that made Emily's skin crawl. And sometimes at 3 a.m., his wild laughter would blast through the intercom. She'd race to his room, but he'd be silent again, smiling at the corner. Emily began a journal, tracking it all: the laughter's timing, the corner he fixated on, the patterns his fingers traced. She even sketched that corner, hoping to see what he saw. But it was just a blank wall. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling something was there. One stormy night, with the windows rattling, Emily sat by his bed. The lights flickered, plunging them into flashes of dark. John's eyes shone in the lightning, calm and bright. Then he spoke. "He's waiting for you," he whispered, his voice nearly lost in the rain. Emily leaned in, goosebumps rising. "Who, John? Who's waiting?" He just smiled, slow and knowing, eyes on the corner. She got him moved to room 5, closer to the nurse's station, hoping a new space might break the spell. Dr. Adler called it environmental triggers. At first, John seemed confused, his eyes roaming. But by night, he'd locked onto a new corner, and the 3 a.m. laughter returned, mocking them. Emily dove deeper, scouring the hospital library for answers: trauma, hallucinations, even ghost stories. Nothing matched. The weirdness spread. Nearby patients reported nightmares, a sense of being watched. An old woman claimed a shadow slipped through her wall, but checks found nothing. Mark requested a transfer, admitting, "I can't handle him. He's bringing something in." It all broke on a freezing November night. Emily was alone at the desk when the intercom crackled with John's frenzied laughter. She ran to him, breath misting in the icy air. He sat on his bed's edge, grinning at the corner. The room was freezing, a faint haze near the ceiling. Emily followed his gaze, and for a heartbeat she saw it. A shadow, too tall, too thin, gone when she blinked. John looked at her, eyes piercing. "He likes you," he said softly, then laughed, the sound spiraling into the night. She stumbled out, slamming the door. After that, John got worse, whispering to the corner, nodding or flinching like he was in a conversation. Emily stopped going in alone, but the fear stuck. She thought about quitting, yet couldn't. Not until she understood. One evening, as the sky burned red, she decided to face it. She stood in his room, took a deep breath, and stepped into the corner he stared at, looking out as he did. At first, just the hospital's hum. Then a cold touch grazed her neck, and a faint whisper, "Emily." She spun, heart hammering, but the corner was empty. John smiled, eyes gleaming. "He's here," he said, looking at her for the first time in weeks, his voice calm and sure. That night, she requested leave. Dr. Adler nodded, no questions asked. She packed, left her journal behind, and walked out at dawn, the hospital's shadow trailing her. John stayed, his laughter a mystery she couldn't unravel. The hospital stood like a relic of a bygone era, its long corridors lined with chipped paint and worn tiles, carrying the echoes of hurried footsteps and quiet sobs. At the far end of a secluded wing sat room 312, a place where the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a pale, uneven glow. The air there always felt a little heavier, a little colder, as if the room held its breath. It had been empty for weeks, ever since its last occupant, Mrs. Thompson, passed away. She'd been a fixture in the hospital for months, her frail form tethered to life by sheer will and a tangle of tubes. The staff had adored her gentle demeanor, her soft voice offering kind words even on her worst days. But when she slipped away one quiet night, something shifted. Room 312 wasn't the same anymore. It began subtly, almost dismissible. One late shift, Nurse Clara was scribbling notes at the station when the call bell from room 312 pierced the silence. She froze, her pen hovering over the page. The room was unoccupied. She'd checked the roster herself. A glitch, she reasoned, and trudged down the hall to investigate. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a still, empty space. The bell hung silent on the wall, its wiring intact. She lingered for a moment, the quiet pressing against her ears, then left, chalking it up to faulty equipment. A few nights later, an orderly named Tom was mopping the floor near room 312 when he noticed the lights inside flicker. He stopped, his mop dripping onto the tiles, and watched as the bulbs pulsed, on, off, on, casting jagged shadows that danced across the walls. A chill prickled his skin, and he muttered a curse under his breath. He finished his task in a hurry, keeping his eyes averted, and vowed to steer clear of that wing for the rest of his shift. Sarah arrived at the hospital a week later, a new nurse with a no-nonsense attitude and a determination to prove herself. She'd heard the rumors about room 312, whispers swapped over coffee in the break room, but she rolled her eyes at them. Ghost stories were just that, stories. Old buildings creaked and groaned. People saw what they wanted to see. Yet, during one of her first evening shifts, she passed by the room while restocking supplies and noticed something odd. A chair, plain and wooden, sat facing the window. She frowned. She could have sworn it had been tucked against the wall earlier. Shrugging, she nudged it back into place, assuming a janitor had been careless. The incidents grew harder to ignore. One night, the call bell rang again while Sarah was on duty. She sighed, expecting another false alarm, and marched toward room 312. As she neared the door, a soft thud echoed from within. Inside, a small medication bottle lay on the floor, rolled a few feet from the bedside table. Her brow furrowed. The table was bare, the room untouched. A draft, perhaps? She glanced at the windows, closed tight, not a whisper of air. She picked up the bottle, unease curling in her stomach, and left quickly. Weeks passed, and the strangeness seeped deeper. One morning, after a grueling shift, Sarah stopped by room 312 to tidy up before heading home. The bed was neatly made, its white sheets crisp and undisturbed. But when she brushed her hand across the blanket, it was warm. Faintly, impossibly warm, as if someone had just climbed out. Her fingers jerked back, her pulse thudding in her ears. She stared at the empty bed, willing her mind to find a rational explanation. The heat lingered on her skin as she backed out of the room. Mark, a veteran nurse with years of experience, had his own brush with the uncanny. Late one evening, he was delivering charts when he passed room 312 and spotted a book on the bedside table. It was Mrs. Thompson's Bible, its worn leather cover unmistakable. She'd read it daily, her trembling hands tracing the pages. Now it lay open, a single verse underlined in shaky ink. "I am with you always." A cold shiver ran up his spine. He snapped the book shut, the sound sharp in the stillness, and hurried away, his usual stoicism shaken. Sarah's skepticism began to crack. She started taking detours to avoid room 312, her steps quickening whenever she neared that wing. But the call bell seemed to follow her, ringing only when she was close. One night, she steeled herself and stepped inside alone. The air felt thick, pressing against her chest. She stood in the center, holding her breath. Then, the lights flickered, and a shadow slid across the wall. Tall, vague, impossible. No one else was there. She bolted, her gasps echoing down the hall. The staff gathered in the break room, their voices low and tense. Tom recounted the flickering lights, Mark the Bible, Sarah the warm bed. Nervous laughter punctuated their stories, but fear lingered in their eyes. Dr. Ellis, the floor supervisor, leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "It's an old building," he said, his tone firm. "Bad wiring, drafts, there's always a reason." His words hung hollow, and no one met his gaze. A storm rolled in one night, the sky splitting with thunder as rain lashed the windows. The power failed, plunging the hospital into darkness. Emergency lights buzzed to life, bathing the halls in a sickly red glow. Sarah, alone on the floor, clutched her clipboard as she passed room 312. A whisper stopped her cold, soft, barely audible. She strained to hear it over the storm. "Help me," it said, faint but clear in Mrs. Thompson's unmistakable lilt. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She stood rooted, the plea fading into the rain's drumming, her mind reeling. The next morning she cornered Mark in the locker room. "I heard her," she said, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Thompson, I swear it." Mark's face darkened. "You're not crazy," he replied quietly. "I've heard it too." A murmur, like she's still calling out. They stood in silence, the weight of their shared dread settling between them. Desperate for answers, Sarah pored over the hospital's records that afternoon. Mrs. Thompson's file painted a lonely picture. No family, just a weekly visit from a priest. She'd died peacefully, at least that's what the charts claimed. But buried in the notes, Sarah found a chilling detail. The priest's final entry described Mrs. Thompson's growing fear of death, of being alone, of what lay beyond. "She doesn't want to leave," he'd scribbled. Sarah's stomach twisted. Was that the key? Was Mrs. Thompson trapped, tethered to room 312 by her own terror? That night, Sarah resolved to confront it. She entered room 312, the door groaning shut behind her. The room was dark, shadows pooling in the corners, lit only by the faint spill of hallway light. She stood by the bed, her heart hammering. "Mrs. Thompson," she whispered, "if you're here, please, let us help you." Silence stretched, taut and heavy. Then the call bell erupted, shrill and relentless. The lights flared, flickering wildly, and the chair scraped across the floor, halting at her feet. Sarah's breath hitched, but she held her ground. "You don't have to stay," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "It's okay to go." The bell cut off abruptly. The light steadied. A soft sigh brushed the air, warm and fleeting, and the room grew still. After that night, room 312 fell quiet. The call bell stayed silent, the lights burned steady, and the bed remained cold. The staff no longer avoided it, though they spoke of it in hushed tones, trading glances. Sarah couldn't erase the memory, the voice, the shadow, the sigh, but a strange calm settled over her. Perhaps Mrs. Thompson had found peace, or perhaps the room had simply let go. The hospital felt lighter, its shadows less oppressive. Yet, as Sarah passed by in the days that followed, she'd pause, her eyes drifting to the corner, half expecting to see a frail figure there, smiling softly as she turned a page. The psychiatric ward of the hospital was a place of strict order and suppressed silence. Long corridors, painted in pale green, were illuminated by the dim light of fluorescent lamps that hummed as if tired from endless work. At night, the air froze, and only occasionally was it disturbed by the creak of a door or a muffled whisper behind the walls of the wards. Grace had been working the night shift for 3 years and had grown accustomed to the rhythm of this place, to its calm, which sometimes exploded into sudden bursts of chaos. But in recent weeks, something had changed. It wasn't the usual problems, staff shortages or patient whims, but rather ward number 12, where Thomas had been for the past 2 months. Thomas was admitted to the ward with a diagnosis of severe anxiety and hallucinations. His medical record was sparse on details, and he himself hardly spoke. He spent his days sitting silently, staring at the wall, or scribbling something in a small notebook that he hid under his pillow. Grace tried to establish contact with him, but he would look away as soon as she entered the ward. Yet, there was something compelling about his silence, as if he was hiding a secret that she was meant to uncover. One evening, while making her rounds, Grace noticed something new on the wall above Thomas's bed. In thin, trembling letters, her name was written, Grace. She froze, her pen hovering over her clipboard. "Thomas," she asked quietly, "did you write this?" He didn't respond. his fingers continuing to trace invisible patterns on the sheet. Deciding it was just a quirk related to his condition, she left, but a slight unease lingered with her. In the following days, the writings began to multiply. Her name appeared again and again, each time larger and more assertive, as if demanding attention. The letters spread across the wall like weeds, intersecting and climbing toward the ceiling. Grace reported this to her supervisor, but he merely brushed it off. "He's fixated. It's normal for his diagnosis. Just keep an eye on him." However, Grace felt it wasn't that simple. She was troubled by how Thomas watched her, how his lips twitched slightly, as if holding back words. Then the messages changed. Next to her name, new words appeared. "You'll see for yourself soon." The phrase was repeated, scratched into the paint with feverish insistence. Grace's heart clenched when she read it. On her next shift, she decided to talk to him. "What do you mean, Thomas? What will I see?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though her hands were shaking. For the first time, he looked her in the eyes, and his gaze pierced through her. "The truth," he whispered in a low, almost growling voice. "You're next." A chill ran down her spine. She stepped back and locked the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Her colleagues began to notice her tension. Mark, another nurse, caught her in the break room. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, frowning. Grace forced a smile. "It's Thomas. He's getting worse." Mark nodded, but doubt flickered in his eyes. "Maybe you should take a couple of days off. This place wears us all down." But Grace shook her head. She couldn't leave now. Thomas's warnings felt personal, as if they were meant only for her. The writings became increasingly frightening. One morning, Grace came on shift and saw that the walls of ward number 12 had turned into a chaotic canvas. "Grace, you're next. You'll see soon. You're next." The letters intertwined, some stretching from floor to ceiling, others crowding into corners, filling every available space. Thomas sat on the bed, his hands stained with ink, his eyes burning with a mad fire. "Thomas," she whispered, "what is this?" He bared his teeth in a crooked, manic smile and said, "It's close. You'll see for yourself soon." Then he laughed, a sharp, ringing laugh that made her knees tremble. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, Thomas's words spinning in her head. "You're next." Next for what? She tried to convince herself it was just hallucinations, the ravings of a sick mind. But their specificity, his obsession with her, wouldn't let her rest. When she finally dozed off, she dreamed of shadows and walls covered in writing, her name repeating in endless circles. In the morning, the ward was in chaos. Staff crowded the corridor, their faces pale. "What happened?" Grace asked, her pulse quickening. Mark turned to her, his gaze dark. "Thomas, he's gone." Her breath caught. "Gone? How?" "Vanished," Mark replied. "The ward is empty. No trace." Grace pushed through to ward number 12. The door was ajar, the bed neatly made, the walls clean, except for one spot. On the mirror, as if written in dried blood, were the words, "Grace, your turn." The police came, but found nothing. Thomas's disappearance defied explanation. All doors were locked, windows intact. It was as if he had dissolved into thin air. The staff searched the ward, the courtyard, even nearby streets, but he was nowhere to be found. Grace stood in the empty ward, staring at the writing on the mirror. Her reflection stared back, pale, with dark circles under her eyes. "Your turn," she whispered, feeling the bitterness of those words. In the following days, the hospital tried to return to normal. A new patient was moved into ward number 12. The walls were repainted, the mirror replaced. But Grace couldn't forget. She began noticing oddities, her name appearing where it shouldn't, scratched into the frost on her car window, written in the steamed-up bathroom mirror, even carved into the wooden surface of her desk. Each time she told herself it was her imagination, a coincidence. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger, as if unseen eyes were following her from the shadows. One night, walking to her car after her shift, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw no one. The parking lot was empty, shadows thickening under the streetlights. Grace quickened her pace, her own footsteps echoing in her ears. Reaching her car, she glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. For a moment it seemed Thomas was sitting in the back seat, his eyes boring into her, his mouth stretched into that same mad smile. She screamed, spinning around, but the seat was empty. Trembling, she drove home, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The strangeness continued. At work, she heard whispers in empty corridors, soft, indistinct, like voices behind walls. Objects moved on their own. A pen rolled off a table. A door creaked, though no one was near. Her colleagues noticed her distraction, her nervousness, but she brushed it off. "Just tired," she said, forcing a smile. But inside, fear tightened its grip. One evening, sitting alone in her apartment, she noticed the light flicker. Grace looked up from her book, her breath catching. The room grew cold, the air thick. Then she heard it, a faint scratching like nails scraping plaster. The sound came from the walls, growing louder, more insistent. She stood, her legs unsteady, and walked to the bedroom. On the wall above her bed, letters began to appear, as if carved by an invisible hand. "Grace, your turn." The words repeated, filling the wall with frenzied script. She stepped back, clamping her hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. The next morning, she took a leave of absence. Her supervisor, concerned by her pallor and trembling hands, agreed without question. Grace packed a bag and left the city, hoping to find peace in a small town far from the hospital. But even there, the whispers followed. Her name appeared in the fog on the window, in the dust on the nightstand. At night, she lay awake, listening to the silence, waiting for the scratching. Months passed. The strangeness subsided, but the fear remained. Grace returned to work, hoping time had severed the connection to Thomas's warnings. The hospital had changed, new staff, new patients, but ward number 12 remained, its door closed, its walls bare. One night, passing by, Grace felt a chill and a faint movement behind the door. She froze, her hand hovering over the handle, then stepped back. Some doors, she decided, were better left unopened, but deep down, she knew it wasn't over. Thomas's final message still hung in the air, a promise or a curse. And somewhere in the shadows of her mind, she heard a faint scratching, waiting for its moment.